Today I will be talking to you about Fabaceae in South Africa, specifically looking at an overview of the new classification on the subfamily level. I'm Stephen Boatwright from the Department of Biodiversity and Conservation Biology at the University of the Western Cape. The Fabaceae are a large family of about 800 genera and more than 20,000 species. It's considered the third largest plant family overall, and the second most economically important, only after the grasses. It has a cosmopolitan distribution, and its species form important ecological constituents in almost all biomes across the world. Traditionally, it was divided into three subfamilies, which many of us know very well: the Caesalpinioideae, Mimosauideae, and the Papilionoideae. And the family as a whole has never been questioned in terms of its monophyly, or whether all of its species are descended from a common ancestor. But on the subfamily level, there have always been questions around specifically Caesalpinioideae, because it is considered paraphyletic, meaning that not all of its species are descended from a common ancestor. And actually the other two subfamilies sit within a sea of Caesalpinioid species if we look in the context of a phylogenetic tree, which I'll show you in the upcoming slides. We can see here a representation of the three traditionally recognized subfamilies. This was mostly done based on floral characteristics. But over time we realized that this is even not as simple, and that there is deviation from these floral characters over time. So we have the Caesalpinioids that typically have this ascending valvation, and the flowers are generally symmetrical across several planes of symmetry, or so-called actinomorphic. We have a valvate estivation in the mimosoids, and they are symmetrical across many planes. And then we have the typical papilionoid flower, I think the one that we all know very well, or we also call it affectionately the pea flower. And this is the one that is strongly symmetrical only across one plane, or bilateral symmetrical, or zygomorphic. Sorry for all of the terms, but we deal in terms in taxonomy. And it has a descending valvation with a very charismatic or characteristic standard petal, the wing petals on the side, and then two petals fused to form a keel petal. So in southern Africa we have quite a nice diversity of the family, and we have about 171 genera and in excess of 1,700 species. Many taxa are introduced because it is such an economically important taxa, so for food and various other things, ornamentals, and there are many weeds that also have made their way into South Africa. As I've said, it's a large and commercially important family in the region, and it has a high representation, especially in the winter rainfall areas of the southern and southwestern Cape, and then also in the northeastern parts of the region. We have many people that have studied these over the last few decades, but in the last 2 decades, these are the most well-known people that have studied the family, and most of them are students of Prof. Ben Erik van Wyk at the University of Johannesburg, and Prof. Michel van der Bank, and Prof. Anna Mutete, both previous students of Prof. van Wyk, also have trained several students in the region. Prof. Charles Sturton has always been working on the Soralias in the group, but has done a lot of work on weedy species as well. And then Prof. Muthama Muasia, that has also worked broadly in the papilionoid legumes. All of you know Marianne and Brian quite well, with their involvement also with crew and various other things from a Sanby perspective, and Brian, a very enthusiastic collector of legumes, of course. So the family luckily has a very long tradition of strong international collaboration and focused work on the family, and this has traditionally also then led to several conferences. The first International Legume Conference was held at Kew in 1978. And as is tradition, it is then held every 3 to 4 years after that. And you can see we most recently had the 8th International Legume Conference in Brazil. And traditionally then there are proceedings in the form of advances in legume systematics that are published from the conferences, and this really advanced the knowledge of the family quite substantially. We were fortunate enough to, as a team, host the 6th International Legume Conference in 2013, and this is where the discussions on actually formalizing the new subfamilial classification really gained momentum. In 2010, what we call the Legume Phylogeny Working Group was established at a meeting in Phoenix, Arizona, with an initial group of members, but it grew quite quickly to become an internationally inclusive organization or group. And the aim was to develop collaborative research towards a comprehensive phylogeny and then classification for the legumes. And this was mostly also then focused around the questions of the subfamily classification. The point of a working group is that it is inclusive of legume research community, and whatever products are delivered, like the new classification, will be community endorsed. It allows for more democratic discussions and decisions on high-level classifications of the group. And then we also, to achieve this common goal, had specific working groups within the family and within the legume phylogeny working group that formed. So-called legume morphology working group, the taxonomy working group, etc. And together we published 3 important outputs, 2 in 2013, and then the very important new classification at a subfamily level in 2017. And this paper is widely taken up in literature and in use, and you can see this by the fact that it has been cited in other research papers 443 times already since 2017. So before we move on to talk about the actual classification, I just want to touch on what natural versus artificial classifications are, and also how we work as taxonomists in order to change classifications. Because I feel sometimes people think we sit in our offices or in the herbarium and one day just decide, oh, I'm bored, let's change the name of whatever group. And that's not at all what we do. So the aim of taxonomy is always to produce classification systems for all organisms on Earth. And these classifications we would like to be intuitive, which means it allows ease of reference to or identification of its components. And this is very much aimed at the users of these classifications, people like you out in the field or researchers in the herbarium. And they must have predictive value in regard to relationships, meaning that if things are placed in the same family or genus, we would assume that they are related to each other. And that speaks then to natural versus artificial classification systems. A natural classification system is a reflection of true relationships between organisms, as is determined by scientific evidence. In the modern age, this is mostly DNA evidence, but it means it encompasses evolution. Artificial classification systems, however, group organisms based on non-evolutionary features or arbitrary features. So I've put an example here of 4 organisms, which we all know well. So, for example, we can classify these in many ways. If we, for example, use the presence of wings to group the organisms above, they will all be included in the same grouping. But we know that they are not related to each other, and that they are actually quite distinct groups within the animal classification. So phylogenetically, we know that the penguin and the eagle are grouped together. They are both birds, for example, so they would be belong to the aves. But even within that, they are not directly related to each other, and they would each belong to their own group. And then we know that the butterfly would belong to its own group as an insect, and the bat as a mammal would belong to its own group. So you can see the different impacts of artificial classification versus phylogenetic classification. So the natural or phylogenetic classification is based on shared characteristics and DNA evidence of relationship, and that's the key word here. So natural classifications are preferred because it allows us to infer information about relationships between taxa and also infer information about their evolution. So taxonomy has always been a very controversial and misunderstood subject, as was said by Clive Stace some years ago. So as new taxonomic evidence becomes available, relationships between species are clarified and changes need to be made. And we don't make these changes just offhand. There's a very specific rule book, the International Code of Botanical Nomenclature, that we use to classify this. And this is a sort of the law book of how to name organisms and how to deal with names of organisms. So we last year had the International Botanical Congress, where these books are discussed every 6 years and revised. So we expect a new code, the Madrid Code, to be published this year. So changes in nomenclature are largely due to taxonomic rearrangement in the first place. This is the result of research concerning morphology, anatomy, DNA sequences, etc. And it leads to new insights and modification of the classification system. So with this evidence, we realize, oh, things are not related to each other, and the classification in that part of the tree is artificial, and we need to fix it to become a natural classification. Sometimes the nomenclature of things is wrong, and we discover older names, and in that case we have to then correct these errors, or there are errors in the typification of names. So there can be various reasons for nomenclatural priority to come in. And then conservation of names. We know that some families have alternative names, such as the Fabaceae. It is also often known as the Leguminosae, and that's because we allow conservation of some names that are in common use but not necessarily correct according to the rules of the code. So name changes we know are not often popular, especially for well-known plant groups such as your horticultural plants or economically important plants. And sometimes they can even be controversial. I'm sure we all still remember the acacia saga, which I won't go into detail about. But we need to make sure that we standardize the way that we think about these things, because in a scientific space, the concepts of genera and species and things are all hypothesis driven and based then on empirical evidence. So we consider the rank of genus a very important one, and one that we need to get right, because the concept of a genus is often in widespread use. And Humphreys and Linde said that good genera are stable and predictive, and useful genera are diagnosable and of a workable size. So we can set up an identification key to them, and they don't have thousands and thousands of species, for example. And then monophyly, or descent from a common ancestor, will most likely ensure both stability and predictiveness, and in turn lead to unambiguity and a broad acceptance, reinforcing stability. So you can hear that stability, workability, predictability are at the heart of what we do and how we would like our classifications to be perceived. There are, of course, always many options and ideas. That's where the empirical evidence comes in, and the solution will present itself from the evidence at hand and where the characters lie, in my opinion. And there's no one-size-fits-all solution. You often hear people say, oh, I'm a splitter or I'm a lumper. That's nonsense. The philosophical question, the solution should come from the data, and as I said, where the characters are placed. Sometimes we enlarge genera, sometimes we have to reduce them in size depending on where the characters are and what would be most stable and most predictable. So coming back to the legume classification, remember that I said that the problem with the three traditional families was Caesalpinioideae, and you can see Caesalpinioideae is represented here by blue. And this is what I was saying. So while the Papilionoideae are monophyletic or have a strong common descent from a common ancestor, as does the Mimozoideae in green, you can see that the Caesalpinioideae does not. And this is what I meant when I said that the other two subfamilies are sitting in a sea of Caesalpinioid species. You can see that there are several what we call splinter lineages, and that we have Papilionoideae and Mimozoideae embedded within. This is what was discussed at the legume conferences and in the papers that we produced as the Legume Phylogeny Working Group, and looking at how to solve this. So the solutions were many that were produced or suggested, should I rather say, but we wanted one that is the most user-friendly. So you can see that there at one point was a 15 subfamily solution, and there was a 10 to 12 subfamily solution and a 6 subfamily solution. In some parts of the tree there was inadequate resolution, and especially the Umtisa grade, which is very famous to legume researchers, is problematic and still remains problematic a little bit, but there is targeted research into this. And also a large number of families is not very useful, not very user-friendly either. So if we were to all of a sudden go from 3 to 15 families, that is quite a big impact. So the 6 subfamily classification was one that was most popular. It meant that these lineages of Caesalpinioideae, we recognized the first 3 as separate subfamilies, we recognized the Papilionoideae, and then we recognized an enlarged subfamily of Caesalpinioideae, but unfortunately including the Mimozoideae, and recognizing the Mimozoideae as a clade that has diverged within a broader Caesalpinioideae. So here you can see from the concerted effort stemming from the 6th International Legume Conference in South Africa, we have then the new classification, where we have a 6 subfamily classification, recognizing then the Papilionoideae, the Caesalpinioideae, which now includes what we now call the Mimozoid clade. We have the Dialoideae, Duparquetoideae, Detarioideae, and the Circidoideae. Consensus was reached based on MATK, which is a region from the chloroplast that we sample and sequence in terms of its DNA. And this is where this phylogenetic tree comes from. And after several options that were considered, we decided that it is better to have a 6 subfamily classification, and that we do not over split the classification just to have Mimozoideae recognized, but that we recognize it as a clade within Caesalpinioideae. So here is a nice visual representation of the new classification and their relationships. We have the Detarioideae of about 84 genera is pantropical. The Circidoideae also pantropical, 12 genera in excess of 300 species. Duparquetoideae is a very interesting West and West Central African lineage. You can see it mimics orchids, which is highly unusual. So it's quite apt that it is placed in its own subfamily. The Dialoideae, 17 genera, 85 species, also pantropical. Then the sessile pineoides, with a broader concept now from the traditional sessile pineoides that we all know. Quite large, 148 genera and in excess of 4,000 species, pantropical, and it includes then the mimozoid clade, the acacias, and those ones that we know so well. And then the largest, the Papilionoideae, with 503 genera and more than 14,000 species, and it's a cosmopolitan group. So I'll show you now. In southern Africa, we only have 5 of the subfamilies represented. To Kepacoideae, obviously we don't have in the country. So we have the largest, also in southern Africa, is the Papilionoideae. We have about 118 genera in excess of 1,500 species, and still they are, for the most part, recognizable by that papilionoid flower that I showed you with the standard wing and keel petals. But in some cases they actually do change their flowers, and it's a genetic abhorrent state where they go back to an undifferentiated format of the flower. So they can actually look very much like a sessile pineoid flower, but be a papilionoid legume. We then have the subfamily Papilionoideae that includes the mimozoid clade, 48 genera in excess of 200 species, and they mostly have the bipinnate or deeply divided leaves, and mostly valvate or imbricate petals. And some of the well-known ones, Caesalpinia, Chamaecrista, Fabaceae, and Senegalia, which are now the African acacia equivalents. The Circidoideae, 5 genera, 16 species, so not very well represented in the flora of southern Africa. The leaves are never bipinnate, and the flowers can be from papilionoid to imbricate. So you can see that there is a bit of overlap in floral characters. So things like Bohenia, Circus, and Tylosema are important members of this. The Deutarioideae, 8 genera, 13 species, and they have intrapetiolar stipules and peripinnate leaves, so quite a unique floral leaf structure. The flowers are radially to bilaterally symmetrical, and things like Clophospermum and Schottia are good examples of this family. And then the Diloideae, not very well represented. These are mostly tropical groups, so big representation in South America, for example. We have 1 genus and 2 species in the FSA. Leaves are imparipinnate. The flowers radially symmetrical, and Dialium is our only representative with 2 species. So just some lovely pictures for you to get a feel of these families and the diversity within. I think that's one of the big things, is that it's such a massive diversity that one is working with. So trying to find a well curated, coherent classification that is, as I said, community endorsed, was quite a large chore. So we see here the representatives of Circidoideae, Dupacetoideae, as I said, that very strange West African legume, and then also the Dialoideae. The Deutarioideae, quite a beautiful group, but again you can see lots of different variations of this this flower type that we have, that was always very typical of the sessile pineoid legumes. Then the sessile pineoideae themselves, that are now quite well known and quite diverse, with the inclusion of the mimozoid clade, and then the Papilionoideae, which we know quite affectionately by what I said, the pea flower. But you can see here very strange variations of the pea flower that we find, some of them that you would swear they could be placed in sessile pineoideae. So lots of convergent evolution, and this is of course all driven by pollination. which is why placing a classification on floral syndromes is not always a good idea because of convergent evolution. So another output which Marianne Leroux was very involved in and one of the leaders of was a community-endorsed global legume checklist. So the legume phylogeny working group, along with this classification, once we were done with the classification, we then moved on to focus on names and checklists for the family. And this actually kept us busy during the pandemic. We were sitting and playing around with names and checklists. So a checklist is important as it serves as a primary source of taxa for biodiversity data platforms and legume-related research. So what happened is that a network of coordinators and contributors were created to check and verify taxa. We had 37 coordinators, at least one for each subfamily, and then within the Papilionoideae, because it's the largest and most diverse, there were several coordinators there. So the checklist was sent out along with instructions on how to verify and curate names. So in total, 80 taxonomists from 24 countries participated in the first round. We are now already several versions in. A total of more than 87,000 names were checked, and the first checklist was then published in 2021 on Checklist Bank and is available for popular use. And this, of course, feeds then into more regional checklists, so our own national checklists, etc. And Marianne and Bruno actually wrote a paper on this, also then explaining the importance of these global checklists and the fact that they are community endorsed. So what is the value of a good checklist? Better quality data for downstream research and applied uses. Checklists are important to index and share linked biodiversity data, and scientific names link all types of data on a taxon to make related information about the species discoverable. So a name is very important, as the rank of species is foundational in our taxonomy, as is the name of a species, and that feeds then into larger hierarchical levels of classification. I hope that you found this useful and that you now are a bit more clear on the new classification for legumes and understand the need for this new classification. Thank you.